anyone who knows ASL even a little bit, and I might even say people who don't know ASL at all, should know proper terminology in the deaf community. So that's what we're going to look at today. So if you see up here where my mouse is, there's a lowercase deaf, uppercase deaf, hard of hearing. What's the difference? All right. So you may have noticed in class so far that sometimes the word deaf is capitalized and sometimes it's not. That is not random. There is a reason for it. So here are the differences between the terms deaf, capital, or lowercase, deaf capitalized, and hard of hearing. Not capitalized, the word deaf refers to a hearing loss. It is a physical, audiological description only. Hard of hearing generally refers to a person with a hearing loss that is not as severe as a deaf person's. In other words, a hard of hearing person often has some degree of hearing and may or may not use a hearing aid of some type. Capitalized, the word deaf, refers to a person with a major hearing loss who is also culturally deaf. Regardless of the degree of hearing loss, deaf with a capital D can also refer to a cultural identity. I have a dear friend who is audiologically hard of hearing, but always calls herself deaf because that is her cultural identity. All right, so let's talk about what that means. To a culturally deaf person, being deaf is more about identity, understanding, and belonging than it is about a physical description, a description of your body and what your ears do or don't do. Deaf, capitalized, is more about identity, understanding, and belonging. Therefore, a hard of hearing person may prefer to identify as deaf, like my friend. Okay, what about the term hearing impaired? Don't use it. It's pretty straightforward. Don't use it. It's very ironically considered politically correct in the general hearing population. But the term hearing impaired implies a lack or an inability, and it is therefore offensive to the deaf. Just say deaf or hard of hearing. No hearing impaired. Other terms sometimes used to refer to the deaf are disabled or handicapped. Many people consider deaf people disabled or handicapped, but what do deaf people consider themselves? Consider the connotations of those words, disabled and handicapped, okay? When you use words like disabled and handicapped, you mean deficient, physically or mentally impaired, unable to function normally, helpless, unfit, unqualified. This is a medical view, a focus on what cannot be done. That is the outsider view of a deaf person. Because the medical perspective on deafness is so much more prevalent than the culturally deaf perspective, which we'll call the insider view, deaf children often grow up with an emphasis on their deficiency rather than their ability. This leads to many deaf children being fitted with hearing aids or cochlear implants at an early age. It is difficult. I want you to consider this perspective. It is difficult for many deaf people to understand or reconcile the outsider perspective of them, in other words, that they have a lack or an inability, with what they know of themselves. They are able to learn, work, raise a family, right? They can go to school and get a job and do everything. So it's kind of confusing for deaf people to understand why other people think that they're disabled or lacking something. So the insider view, this is the view of what deaf people think about themselves. And it is that they are capable, not handicapped. They are able, not disabled. So I want you to think about this perspective. Think about it in this way, because this is exactly how deaf people think about it. Culturally deaf people, right? All right, so my mom was short. She was smart. She was talented, capable. Her body was smaller than an average person, all right? Being short required some adjustments on her part sometimes, but it didn't make her disabled or handicapped. It just meant she was short, right? Shortness was a difference to be dealt with. She was just short. That is exactly how deaf people view themselves. They view themselves as entirely capable people who are not disabled or handicapped, but who simply have a physical difference to be dealt with. They're not handicapped, they're just deaf. Okay. So this is a very different perspective from most hearing people. And this is something that surprises most hearing people. But the deaf view of the deaf is that deaf people can do anything except hear. And they obviously find a lot of ways to get along in life without hearing. So it's not a big deal. This quote was spoken by the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. Gallaudet is the main liberal arts university for the deaf in the United States. And the first president, deaf president, his name was Dr. I. King Jordan. And he said this in, was it his acceptance speech, or was it right before that? I think it was right before that, but anyway, I should look it up. It's this beautiful speech, but anyway, in it, that's what he said. Deaf people can do anything except hear. And that was in 1990. And that is basically deaf people's mantra today, is that deaf people can do anything except hear.